Welcome everybody. I'm John Morgan, I'm President of the Trades Council. Tonight's meeting is obviously about public transport. It's something that obviously if you work in Manchester or Greater Manchester and you don't use a car is essential and often causes huge amounts of discussion. But given the political situation where we've got a Greater Manchester Mayor and Andy Burnham who has powers to regulate the buses, etc., there has been great expectations over the future of public transport and hopes that we can somehow steer our own course here in the Northwest and improve public services. Andy Burnham obviously has made plans, has made statements, but so far we haven't seen everything that we would hope to. Tonight we've got two speakers. It'll be Craig Johnstone, who's from the RMT Relief Regional Organiser for the North. So obviously, Craig will be talking about the train system. But we're going to start off with journalist and campaigner with the Better Buses for Greater Manchester campaign, Caroline Blase. I'm sure that Caroline is going to tell us about the current situation with the buses in Greater Manchester. And I've alluded to Andy Burnham. I'm hoping she's going to give us some information about that. So I'll hand over to Caroline.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me as well. I'm just going to give a general overview of the Better Buses for Greater Manchester campaign because I'm not sure how many people here are that familiar with it. I know Jackie probably is because I did a talk for her organisation as well, so she will know. Basically, it was started in 2018 by Pascal Robinson of We Own It. And We Own It campaigns for public ownership of brain's gone, things that used to be public, so things like canalways and keeping the NHS in public ownership and renationalising the railways and various other things like that. And I think buses have been on their radar for a while. There had, to give you a little bit of context, there had been an earlier attempt by another area of the UK to take their buses back into public control before Manchester did it. It was Tyne and Wear, and they had a go at it in 2015, but the legislation was different in 2015. It was before the 2017 Bus Regulation Act, and they failed because the bus companies in Tyne and Wear, despite it all getting passed by the council, etc., the bus companies decided to sue the arse off them, basically, excuse my language there, and they had to capitulate and they had to back down, so it never actually happened. The 2017 Act strengthens the powers that the Metro Mayors have got in order to take their buses back under public control. It doesn't allow for the complete reversal of the deregulation that happened in 1986. So, for example, they're not able to launch their own bus companies, which is what we had in Greater Manchester prior to 1986. You had GM buses. They're not able to do that. It allows for a choice between partnerships, which is what we have at present, where the bus companies are in control, and the other option is franchising, which is closer to the relationship that Transport for London have in relation to how they run their buses and tube system, etc. in London. That is what Andy Burnham has decided to do, is the franchising system. To get back to the campaign, Pascal started it in 2018, and one of the first things she did was go around Greater Manchester with surveys along with activists from Acorn, and they interviewed people and asked them what they thought of their buses. So there was a lot of talking to people at bus stops, a lot of finding out people's thoughts and what the issues were, etc. And they found that what people generally thought was that the buses were too expensive, too unreliable, and it was actually quite hard to get where you needed to go on them because routes had been scrapped or buses were irregular and didn't turn up, etc. There was the first public meeting of Better Buses for Greater Manchester happened in early 2019. That was a big public meeting at Manchester Art Gallery, which over 100 people attended. And it was from that meeting that obviously names, addresses, emails, etc. were gathered, and a sort of a campaign to involve the public more was started at that point. So you ended up pretty much from that meeting, but gradually as time went on throughout 2019 particularly, you ended up with a large list of people who were involved in the campaign in various ways, involved in various actions, involved in gathering signatures for the petition to put pressure on Andy Burnham to bring the buses back under public control. There were people from all across all the 10 regions in Greater Manchester, so just all of them. Some of them were quite small groups, so I think Rochdale, it was only a couple of people from Rochdale, but they were very passionate and they were able to do a lot just with a couple of people. The Stockport group was pretty big, and Tameside was a reasonable size, I think, as well. And what happened was you would have regular meetings, you'd have actions that we would commit to. So we did a lot of almost, I hate to say stunt-based stuff, but we did a lot of stuff that meant we could get press attention, and that meant we could get Andy Burnham's attention. So we did things like a long bus queue outside his office was one of the things we did. We had the petition going as well. What else did we do? We had the musical, Bus Regulation the Musical. That was a collaboration between the Manchester campaign and an activist in Glasgow who is part of Get Glasgow Moving, who are campaigning for changes to public transport in Glasgow, including buses. Their situation is slightly different because the legislation is slightly different, but Ellie, who did the musical, ideally wants to do different regional ones and take them all around the country, because it's a good way of explaining what's actually quite a complicated story to people in a way that's engaging and interesting, because talking about buses, it can be quite a dry subject, especially when you have to go into a lot of legislation and what can and can't be done and what was done at the time, etc. So we had Bus Regulation, the musical. That was in the summer, I think summer or autumn of 2019. What we were working towards was the point where the consultation was announced, and we tried to put a lot of pressure on Andy Burnham and people at GMCA around the time of the first consultation, which was in late 2019, and that ended in January, beginning of January 2020. So we actually handed in the petition, I think, on the last day of the consultation, and we did a march from the Stagecoach depot in Bellevue. Yeah, Bellevue. We did a short march from there to Andy Burnham's office on Oxford Street, and we presented, well, he wasn't there, but we presented it to his office at that point. We had Andrew Gwynn with us, who is the MP for Denton and Reddish. He came along, he did a little speech, and he supported the campaign throughout. He actually spoke at the Stockport meeting that we had in the December. So we had the consultation, and then we were just sort of waiting to see what they would say after the consultation, and then COVID happened basically before any decision could be made. So it was all very, what do we do now sort of thing at that point. We knew who was going to have to make some kind of decision at some point, because the consultation we knew had come back with, I think it's something like 86% of people who filled out the consultation wanted to take the buses back into public control. And it was, how many responses were it? It was over 8,000, I think. I think that was the first one. I'm not sure how many it was for the second one. What happened was a second consultation had to happen because of COVID, and that happened in late 2020, I think. It was late 2020. And again, the results were sort of not sat on, but they kind of, it all went a bit quiet for a bit, and then he finally announced in March that he was going to bring it back into public control. And the difference between the results of the second consultation and the first one was 86% were in favour, the second one 83% were in favour. The turnout was lower for the second one because of COVID related factors, so it was harder to get the message out that there was a second consultation for a start. And also paper ones had been available during the first one. They've been available in public libraries to fill in, and community centres and things like that. You couldn't really get them to people during the second consultation through those means, not really in the same way because of lockdowns and things. But the result came back essentially the same, that people did still want to do it. And the second consultation actually asked about COVID, because they had to do that from a legal point of view before they could be seen to be saying, yes, we've consulted properly on this. So in March, you made this announcement. We knew the bus companies were going to do a legal challenge because they'd said that since 2019 they were going to do a legal challenge if he said yes. So that judicial review that was launched by Stagecoach and the parent company of Diamond Buses, that began at the end of May. That is still ongoing at this stage, but it's hoped that GMCA have done all the right things legally, have ticked all the right boxes, etc. And, you know, fingers crossed, there will be nothing that the judicial review can find that would cause them to say you can't do this, basically. So that's where we're at the moment. There have been sort of side campaigns that different regional groups have been supporting, or the main group has been supporting along the way, such as the recent dispute between Go Northwest and the drivers about fire and rehire. That was all kicked off sort of late last year-ish. And we did have one of the drivers spoke at one of our meetings late last year on Zoom and explained the circumstances of that. So people were out on the picket line supporting them. Another thing that happened, and this was just before COVID, because it was already a load of bus routes that were being slashed and cuts coming through along the line in early 2020 pre-COVID. So one of the bus routes we were fighting to save, they didn't really need our help, to be honest. They had it sorted, the community in question, but there's a bus route called the 375 that runs from Stockport Town Centre to Mellor, and that was going to be scrapped altogether, which would have meant the community in Mellor had no bus service at all if that had gone. So they were up in arms about it. Luckily, the Manchester Evening News were very good at reporting on that, and they did some very good reporting about what it would mean if it had gone. And I think all the local MPs around there and the local councillors were all very much against it as well. So that, I think that more than us helped to save the route, but it wouldn't have just been the community in Mellor that would have been cut off. It would have been part of the community in Hazel Grove as well, because there's a section of Hazel Grove near the Valley Estate that would have had no bus route either if that had gone. And in both cases, there were a lot of elderly people living around there who use the bus, but also in Mellor particularly, there were a lot of school children who were commuting to college or to school in places like Marple, who would have had no way of getting to and from school or college if it had gone as well. So that was another one we did. I remember one of the campaigners was going around sticking things on bus stops during lockdown 1 to do with that and things like that. So that's just sort of a general overview of it.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to introduce now Craig Johnstone, and as I said before, he is the RMT Relief Regional Organiser for the North, and he's going to be speaking obviously about the public railways. So I'll hand over to Craig.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to speak. We're in really challenging and uncertain times, I think. As well as the Tory government, with a majority of 80, or is it now 81 after the debacle in Hartlepool, we've got the post-COVID pandemic change in public transport usage. And we can't judge yet how permanent any decline in public transport usage will be, if at all, at this stage. It's fair to say that despite the warm words of building back better, there's absolutely no intention of doing that. Key workers who kept the country moving, along with many others, have been forgotten about in the mainstream media and by the government. Indeed, they're facing enormous attacks on jobs, terms and conditions, wages, and the industry I'm in on pension rights too, and I'm imagining that's the same elsewhere. Be under no doubt or any illusion, this is austerity on steroids. From potential cuts to bus routes, which we've talked about what happened before in Manchester, the same thing we've seen in Nottingham with the Link bus service going, the same thing in many parts of the country. To the obscenity of fire and rehire, casualisation of the workforce, to almost unbelievable intentions in terms of the rail industry. There is an agenda and it must be resisted for the sake of the environment, for communities, for connectivity, for the economy, for inclusivity, we need more public transport provision, not less of it. And it needs to be safe, which is why some of the rumoured cuts been proposed by, for example, Network Rail to maintenance are frankly frightening. Cuts to track inspections and staff. You know, we're just talking months after the Stonehaven rail crash where 3 people were killed. And that is down to a lack of environmental works in rough terrain in Scotland. It is almost a mirror image of what happened at Greyrig in the Lake District when a Pendolino train came off the tracks. That ended up with 4 of my members being arrested without charge for about 12 months before they were completely exonerated, and the public inquiry into that particular incident made it clear that the cause of the crash at Greyrig and the derailment was unrealistic workloads and bad management. But those 4 members of staff, frontline Network Rail operatives, had that hanging over them for 12 months. And with all that comes another agenda to axe and slash station staff, the people who help passengers at stations, to potential cuts to on-train staff. We don't need this just to be resisted by rail workers, but let me tell you, it will be, but by communities as well. And it's not just on rail, but it's on buses as well, and on light rail systems too. I deal with the Tyne and Wear Metro, where there's a cut agenda there as well. Only by gathering strength and uniting our resistance can, in my opinion, we win. And I want to talk just a little bit about Great British Railways. You know, it used to be British Railways. Obviously, some civil servant must have been watching the Great British Bake Off and decided we'll put the word great in front of it and see if that gathers any traction with the media. And yes, it did. Unfortunately, I've got to say that the lack of investigative journalism around headlines these days is really quite frightening. So, you know, so what is Great British Railways? Well, at the moment, I can tell you it's a tabard, and that's all it is. All we know is that it will be a cover, that tabard, for more cuts, whilst leaving private profiteers back in place in the industry. And let's be clear, when the Tories announced this Great British Railways jamboree, the media on that morning basically said that the private sector was being moved out and we were going back to British Rail. That wasn't the case, and it wasn't until later on that they actually said in news programmes that the private sector was remaining in place with all the profiteering that goes with it. It was quite frankly sickening media coverage. It is a pointer, as I say these days, to the lack of investigative journalism. And we've seen it before, because the East Coast Main Line collapsed on numerous occasions. Their franchises have collapsed. And we had the pathetic Chris Grayling actually saying that the reason why he was taking it back was to bring an iconic brand of LNER back to the railways. And that was the headline as well. On the West Coast Main Line out of Manchester Piccadilly, you can now get standard Premier, where you would need a degree in computers to use the app in order to basically order a bacon butty. But it's gimmicks and froth, and it covers an agenda for cuts all the way through, whether it's train catering, whether it's station staff, whether it's key maintenance staff on the tracks. They're all facing cuts. And, you know, I'm in the union office here now, we've got the Cut Fares Not Guards placard behind us. I can't say with any certainty that they won't come back and try another attack on the role of the Guard and de-staffing trains, as well as stations and as well as the infrastructure. So we face an enormous challenge, and only by being united and determined will we be able to fight off these attacks. There is another issue that is particularly pertinent to Manchester, and I'll put it on the agenda just for discussion. There is a potential local government takeover of rail services, not necessarily the trains, but certainly the stations. They've already started that at Horwich Parkway Station, where it's been transferred over to Greater Manchester Transport, away from Northern, the current operator. My view is that local MPs and local councils need to have a very key and defining role in the railways, and so do local communities. But what we don't need is a further fragmentation of the railway industry on top of all the other fragmentations that we've had before. And the couple of members of staff that we had at Horwich Parkway were then told that the union that they'd been in for years, the RMT, was no longer recognised, and they couldn't be members of the railway pension scheme, and they lost other terms and conditions as well in this TUC transfer. And what makes me so profoundly unsettled about this is I used to be a Labour councillor up in Carlisle, nowhere near as big as the Greater Manchester metropolis, but we used to provide local council services, and for years they were under attack, and for years we lost more and more of those services, from housing to leisure facilities to environmental works, all those things, we lost them. And now we've got like local councils saying we want to be in control of large swathes of the national rail network, bringing our own branding and things to that, and with all the things that that might mean for rail workers. And I need to air a word of caution on this. If they didn't have the money for local services and to provide local services, and they haven't had for years, then how can they be so sure that the financial settlements will be in place to allow them to properly fund the railways going forward if they take over large swathes of it? So these are all major questions that are currently unanswered. We're facing large-scale cuts agendas, attacks on safety and jobs, and the only thing that we have in our armoury with the Tories' majority in Westminster is our collective strength to resist them. And I urge all trade unionists, and I've done the same at my trades council recently, we need to up our game as individual trade unions and collectively to make sure we can fight the challenges that we've got coming down the track, for want of a better word. And I'm happy to take any questions if anyone's got any questions on the specifics. But obviously there's a lot of stuff there that I've said, and people might have some questions on the detail.
Craig, thank you very much. I'll open up questions to the floor in a second to both of our speakers. Maybe I could start off though, Craig. Can I ask a question about just for clarity? So you've painted a picture of cuts and austerity. Obviously, that's something we associate with the government. Obviously, also the rail industry, a lot of it is privatised, most of it. So are private companies sort of enthusiastically joining in that? Is there any joined up handwriting with the government? Are they doing the same thing, or is this just random attacks from all angles?
Oh no, it's quite orchestrated. They've got an organisation called the Rail Industry Recovery Group, which is supposedly in relation to coming out of COVID, and that is pushing an agenda for large-scale cuts across the train operating companies. Many of them now aren't in private hands. Quite a number have gone into public hands, like Northern, after the shambles that we're seeing with them over service reductions and all the strikes over DOO and stuff. They're now in public hands. But it doesn't matter whether they are or they're not. They all sit round a table together and have a significant cuts agenda that they're all progressing down their own particular strands. I deal with Network Rail, and they are really pushing a massive cuts agenda at the moment.
All right, thank you very much. Okay, I will open it up to the floor now. So I will ask Caroline a question. Caroline, we were talking obviously about Andy Burnham and his plans to take the bus back in. What sort of pushback is there coming from the private companies? Because obviously you mentioned Go Northwest, that which we've done a lot of work with the people who were striking there. So what sort of pushback is coming from the private companies? Do they see this as the end of their right to make money, and what's happening?
The pushback actually happened long before, long before the first consultation, really. As soon as there was any kind of traction on the campaign, that the pushback started. I know around the time of the first consultation, there were a number of attack ads that appeared on buses, basically rubbishing the prospect of putting them back into public reform. Because I think the big thing they tried to push back with was, oh, your council tax will go up, or it'll be by this much, it'll be horrible, blah, 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 all this sort of thing. And, we've been doing this for years and we know what we're doing, etc., etc. I think the amount that was quoted at the time, and obviously things have changed since it was done, so it probably doesn't bear relevance now, but I think the actual costing that GMCA did for council tax was, it would be an extra £17.50 a year, I think was what they have said, but the bus companies were trying to make out like it was a lot more than that. I know Pascal used to get a lot of trolling on the social media account as well from people who seem to be connected to various bus companies in various ways. So there's a bit of that. But the main thing they did was they Stagecoach specifically, because just in case you don't know, Stagecoach and First are the two bus companies that dominate the Greater Manchester market for buses. Basically, it's like a double monopoly. Stagecoach have the monopoly in South Manchester and First have it in North Manchester, essentially. And Stagecoach, during this first consultation, announced they were building a war chest of money they were going to use to do a judicial review, basically, to challenge the decision if it went against them. That was during the first consultation. The results weren't even in at that point. So there was the attack ads, there was that, and then obviously now the judicial review is ongoing, and toys being thrown out of prams all over the place, basically. So yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Eddie Garner's got his hand up. Still muted, Eddie.
Yeah, got it. Yes, some observations rather than questions. Yeah, fantastic speeches there by the colleagues. We know every time there's privatisation, it always ends up much worse, and everyone, racing to get the profits and getting in each other's way, and the public come last. This observation that workers are being blamed for the system failure, this is just frightening, isn't it? I've seen that in the public sector, in the courts, but if something goes wrong there, someone can get unlawfully arrested, which is bad enough. But obviously, if you get the train work, the train network going wrong, obviously someone can get killed. It's just not acceptable in any of this stuff. And then we know once in a while the people who own all these companies, they haul before the parliamentary committee. All that happens is we see it, so often, don't we? Every few weeks for something or other, you get knuckles wrapped, say, "Oh, very sorry," but they're still laughing all the way to the bank. So it's just empty words. They're still protected by the, public company status. Nothing happens to them personally, and that's it. Just one last thing while I'm talking. The fire and rehire, of course, this is so important, and we keep getting told it's not right. I heard Boris say last week at Prime Minister's question time, he said, "Oh yeah, that's only to be used as a last resort, just where it's necessary to keep the jobs." Well, of course, these are all empty words. There's been a few debates in the House. There's been petitions that have reached over 100,000, made them have to listen to petitions. But at the moment, I know nothing has improved. I know Rebecca Long Bailey MP has been trying her hardest to get something done, and that. And then, but yeah, when things are so cut that they're going back to the workers trying to cope with these things, apart from the burnout and the stress, you can only do so many things at once, which is, of course, why we're not supposed to use the phone when you're driving. Your concentration's in two directions. And just as a slight levity, I remember when the one-man buses first come out, apparently driver drove through Woolworth's window, and when asked what happened, he said, "I don't know, I was upstairs collecting the fares." I think it's a joke, but forget that one. But no, you can only do so many things at once. And, you know, then we're blamed for the failures of the system, you know. Anyway, enough said for now. Okay.
Thank you, Eddie. Right, I'll hand over to Evan. But you wish you'd made that joke, Evan.
Well, funnily enough, I used to tell that joke many years ago. I mean, it's like a, you know, it's like a 90. The ironic thing is, of course, it's a 1970s style joke, but actually things got worse since the 1970s. So, you know, in the 80s and all the rest of it, in terms of all this. But yeah, I mean, what I wanted to say really, and again, this is more of a comment. Well, it is a comment rather than a question. It seems to me, and I'm talking specifically about the announcement that Andy Burnham made. I think we've got to have trade unionists and you know, and service users, public transport users, and obviously a lot of the time we're the same people, have got to have a kind of double response, you know, twin track response to this. Because on the one hand, clearly, it's positive, you know, as far as it goes. And if it wasn't, you know, the bus companies wouldn't be doing their utmost to try and stop it from happening. So, and I think, you know, obviously people like Caroline and other people involved in the Better Buses campaign, as well as the unions, as well as many other people, have actually played quite a big role in getting the politicians, particularly Burnham, to the position where he's in now. But obviously, on the other hand, you know, there's the problem that it's limited to the question of control rather than ownership. You know, so that is a big, you know, that's a big limitation in and of itself. But that shouldn't stop us from welcoming it. But what there also is the need for monitoring. That's the, you know, that's the key thing. We hope that it gives the possibility of better services, cheaper fares, better, you know, better conditions, maybe improved conditions for the workers in the industries. You know, those possibilities are all there, but all they are possibilities. So really, to me, it's a question of how we unite all of us in the, you know, in the unions, specific unions that are involved in public transport, in the wider trade union movement, and in the growing sort of movement of community activists and service users, militant service users organisations, to actually ensure that the promises that we feel we've been given are going to actually, you know, to ensure that they actually come about, and particularly given, you know, and I think, you know, Craig, you know, what Craig's described is actually the reality. That's the background to the political situation of, you know, where this is all happening. You know, it's not going to get any better unless people fight for it to get better. It's just that we need the confidence to see that things can, you know. So, you know, that's really what, I mean, a lot of what I'm saying probably sounds like the bleeding obvious, you know. So, but I think it does need to be stated that needs to, I think that needs to be our goal. And what I will also say, sorry, just to finish, that I'm saying this in the background of this all coming about in the context of Burnham becoming taking this position as Greater Manchester Mayor, in the context of this combined authority setup. Bear in mind, a lot of us, including in my recollection, Manchester Trades Council, although I wasn't a delegate at the time this was all going on, but certainly in terms of other groups that I was involved in and still am, we didn't want this, right? We didn't think that this was the best way forward for democracy, this combined authority and all the rest of it. We've got it, but it's not the ideal way to actually monitor these things. And we can't, and I don't think it's a structure that can be trusted. It's what's there, but there is that added side to it. So it's about monitoring and uniting together to monitor it in everybody's interest.
Thanks, Evan. I'm going to go over to Frank Ellis.
Yeah, Frank Ellis, TSSA. I'm afraid I'm going to direct a question to Craig, which will be of interest to my branch, Lancashire Cumbria General. I hope I don't bore everybody else with it. A while back, there was a suggestion from Andy Burnham that all the stations in Greater Manchester would be handed over to his control. We were concerned because there are several companies operating them, Network Rail, some, Avanti as it now is, others, and so on, and Northern Rail, all different, slightly different terms of service, and as you say, access to the Railways Pension Scheme, which, to not bore everybody else, is actually all in different sections. So I actually draw from a very obscure section from when I worked in British Rail Research, called the Scientific section. I was interested that this had actually happened at Horwich, because we haven't heard about that. And I know if you could trouble you to tell us a little bit more about how many staff were involved, whether there were booking office staff involved or what type of staff there were involved. And again, as you say, do they really not protect the rights to the Railways pension? Sorry to bore everybody else, but you're of great interest to my branch.
So I think that's directed at Craig, if you could.
Yeah, I'll answer that very quickly. There was only a couple of members of staff who were involved at Horwich Parkway too, but they lost they were effectively told that they had to join one of the local government unions. They couldn't remain in the RMT and be recognised because the RMT isn't recognised by Greater Manchester Transport. So they were told they had to join a local government union. They were also told that they had to leave the railway pension scheme and join the local government pension scheme, which is, I have to tell you, less lucrative. Ours is a DB scheme. And I dealt with the local government pension scheme on the Tyne and Wear Metro, and it wasn't as good. I mean, we still told them to join it because it's certainly better than nothing and many of the other schemes that are out there. But it wasn't as good as the RPS. And then we also had to have a discussion because pensions aren't a TUP issue. So what concerns me is the point you made there about Andy Burnham and people in Greater Manchester, in Transport for Greater Manchester, saying that they want to take control of these stations. In our opinion, it's a further fragmentation of an already fragmented industry. And I don't know how it fits in with the National Rail Network. So whilst there'd be some advantages, no doubt, on a local basis, you could see how the buses services might be operated from railway stations or whatever. I can't see the advantage in terms of being part of a national rail network. And certainly it's not been ruled out that they'll try and take over all the stations or a large number of the stations in Greater Manchester. And my local RMT branch has just put a resolution through to our executive saying we need a meeting with Andy Burnham to find out what his intentions are in relation to that.
Thanks, Craig. I'm going to bring Chris in a minute, but before I do, can I just ask a question to Caroline? Andy Burnham seems to be the constant here in these conversations. I don't want to be cynical, but some people think that Andy Burnham might jump ship if a particular job came up. So my question to you is, all these schemes, how secure are they if Andy suddenly disappeared?
It would depend on when he disappeared, to be honest, because he has brought forward by a year the plans for the buses. So I think it's now, the whole thing is meant to be done by 2024 instead of 2025 now, because they're doing it in sections. They're not doing the whole 10 areas in one go. It's like sort of half one point and half the other point. So I think North Manchester is being done before South Manchester is what it comes down to. And ironically, I think Bolton are being done first, and they were the one where their council voted against it. And ironically, they're being done first. But yeah, that's just a peculiarity of it. So if he suddenly felt the call to become Labour leader before 2024, it could cause some problems. But if it was after 2024 and the bus work had been done, it would probably cause less problems. It would depend on where things were by that point, really. I mean, looking at where we are generally in the political, I mean, you can't predict politics and elections these days anyway, but assuming that you had to wait 5 years for a general election, and assuming you didn't change Labour leader in the course of that point, both of those are quite big ifs, I know, then fingers crossed it will be done before he suddenly feels the call. I mean, there's no guarantee that he would be elected leader. That's the other thing as well, isn't it? He might throw his hat in the ring, and he's done that before and he's not been made leader. So I know why people are concerned about that, because that's been a little bit of a concern for me as well. But I think at the moment, fingers crossed for the next 5 years at least, I would hope.
Right. It is concerning though, isn't it, that the whole idea of planning for public transport should be done for the good of the nation. And when it could potentially hang on the political fortunes of individuals, it's just doesn't seem right.
I just think it's endemic of the way politics works in this country, unfortunately, which is, I mean, politics at a national level, not politics at a local level particularly, but everyone just thinks in 5-year blocks, and it really depresses me.
Right, thank you. Chris?
Well, that last comment fits in quite neatly with the first thing I was going to say, which is we might not be talking about a 5-year block, we might be talking about a 10-year block, and God knows how long, given the state of the Labour Party leadership. And that makes me want to echo, I mean, what Evan said was very, very much what I was thinking of saying in terms of that need for community, trade union, and everybody else link up, because it has been the case that where there's been good, solid local campaigns, things have been knocked back on occasions because, you know, ordinary people are making their voices heard. So I think we need to address that. I mean, and I think on this thing about Evan's absolutely right about where he said we didn't want the current local government set up in Greater Manchester at all. And I think it would be a really good idea. This would be something for Conor from the RMT branch to do, perhaps, to actually bring something to the Trades Council on this matter of the privatisation of the stations, or the municipalisation of the stations, or whatever they're calling it. Because I personally feel that is something where we should be supporting what's being said by Craig in terms of his concerns about that. And it could be something that, if we discuss and accept it, we actually take forward in the short term, because I'm sure that will happen. It'll happen quite the short term when they can get away with it. Which brings me back to Horwich. The first campaign I was involved in to do with the railways 40 years ago was to defend over 1,000 railway jobs in Horwich. And it's very, very sad to hear the latest railway news from Horwich is that the last 2 rail workers in Horwich are being moved out of the union that they're loyal to. But at the time that failure happened, people might not realise this. Conor might remember it because we talked about it 2 or 3 years ago in terms of doing a meeting. The RMT, it might have been the NUR then, voted not to strike against driver-only operations. And on the back of that rejection of strike action, a 35-year-long, 40-year-long dispute has gone on, endlessly being fought by the RMT. And if that isn't a case of showing what can be done by long-term resistance and never wanting to give up in adverse situations, I think that is a point that really makes working. And in fact, I think the start of that dispute in the early 80s in the RMT was what created the change of union leadership, the sweetheart union that we had at the time of the drastic, terrible closures in Horwich 40 years ago, through to a far more dynamic and fighting and growing union, RMT, that we have now. End.
Thanks, Chris. I'm going to go over to the other Chris Neville.
Cheers, and thank you to our speakers. Kind of a bit of a question for Caroline, really. I think you kind of touched on it. So when the Burnham announced that stuff was being brought into public control, I know a lot of people kind of thought it meant public ownership. And it's my understanding that was potentially an option. Or am I wrong in that? And I just wonder if you could speak a little bit more about that. Was that a lack of kind of will or a lack of funding that GM had available that made that decision, or was it just, I guess, Obviously, that would have been fought even harder, I suppose, by the bus companies if that was the preferred route as well, wouldn't it?
The system that they've gone for, which is the franchising system, you're right, it's not full public control. I mean, it's not a full reversal of deregulation. It's actually legally impossible to completely reverse the deregulation that took place in 1986. This is the point where I'm going to have to ask you to read the 2017 Act, because the devil is in the detail. It really is. If you read it, I've read it fairly recently because I've been writing about both the Manchester campaign, but also the other campaigns there are around the country now, because Manchester is not the only one that's campaigned for this. There are campaigns in Yorkshire, there are campaigns in Bristol, campaign in Glasgow, and the legislation in England and Wales, which is the Bus Regulation 2017 Act, only allows for partnerships, which is the current system, or for franchising. It doesn't allow for, I think I mentioned this at the beginning, but I may not have been very clear on it. One of the things they're explicitly not allowed to do under the current legislation is if the GMCA decided to launch its own bus company, they can't do that legally. Basically, they're not allowed to do that. What they are allowed to do is get involved with things like regulating fares and timetables and things like that. But the private sector bus companies still have to be involved. So you're still having to work with the private sector bus companies, and that's in the law. Basically, it's what we've got to work with. Unfortunately, I know because I know Pascal quite well. If Pascal could have campaigned for a full reversal of the deregulation that happened in 1986, she damn well would have campaigned for it, and we'd have all backed her up. But unfortunately, we had to go for this fudge instead, because that's all that there was available to us. And I think the reason people got behind it, which I didn't mention before as well, is because the current situation is just so atrocious. People would have gone for anything that would have made it even remotely better, basically, and that's the hope that's behind it. So I get your point, but yeah, unfortunately not. Interestingly, the legislation in Scotland is different. Theirs was in 2019. They can do that. They can pretty much reverse deregulation in Scotland if they want to, but their legislation was introduced in late 2019, just before COVID. It's never been enacted. The Scottish government have not enacted it. It's there on the statute books if they want to use it, but they're actually facing a different battle in Scotland at the moment, because it's quite complicated, and I'll try and get it right. Basically, they're at the point where funding is being made available in places like Glasgow to improve the bus network, but it's conditional on them remaining in a partnership setup for the next 5 years, which would set back the likelihood of public control in Scotland, basically. But local council's hands are quite tied on that, and also they seem to be quite keen to work with the bus companies there as well, in a way that they're not. I think the relationship between councils here and the private bus companies is a lot more adversarial than it seems to be in Scotland at the moment. So the situation in Scotland is different, and in theory they could do it, but we can't, unless they change the law again, which I think if the judicial review succeeded and Andy Burnham suddenly found he wasn't allowed to take the buses back into public control after all, I think you'd have to change the law again at that point, as you did after what happened in 2015.
Thanks. Craig, can I ask you a question which is relating to both of you? Obviously, you were talking about Northern being taken back into public control, and I'm sure that was sort of chaotic in the sense that that wasn't the government's preferred option, but they were forced to. Are there any lessons that the bus people can learn from the way that that went back into public control? Is there anything from that you can point out as a parallel?
Well, I was involved in the campaign as relief organiser for the RMT in Yorkshire to try and take their buses back, and the franchising model. The RMT is actually opposed to the franchising model in relation to the buses, because it doesn't give us exactly what we want, but for all the reasons that's been explained in terms of the legislation, it's the only show in town. And really, franchising has been an unmitigated disaster on the railways. So it may be problematic on the buses but it's the only thing that we've got in our toolbox to get any sort of public control over this. So I guess we have to get in there and make the best of it that we possibly can. There was a couple of points I wanted to make. The issue over Andy Burnham. Andy Burnham was really quite useful to us in the campaign to keep guards on trains, because the other guy who was involved in a lot of this was Sir Richard Leese, and he was up to his neck in getting guards taken off trains. He had actually had local government officers in Greater Manchester, in Manchester City Council, working with the DfT on the franchise specifications that put driver-only operation in. And I remember me being in Manchester Town Hall having a hell of a row with him while the Christmas markets were going on outside over this. So, you know, the difference between the politicians in Manchester makes a big difference to transport provision across the whole of the north. And one of the other things I would mention here is this strange quango body called Transport for the North, which frequently meets in Manchester. Its meetings are open, but very few people know about them. And you get all sorts of information at these meetings about how the railways are interfacing with local government, what cuts are planned, what developments are planned, and all those sort of things. So if anyone's got any spare time, Google Transport for the North and nip down to one of the meetings. You'd be really interested in some of the debates and some of the decision making that's going on there.
Right, thanks, Craig. Evan.
Yeah, I mean a couple of points. Sorry, a couple of points. First of all, to Caroline on this issue about Scotland, about you're talking about a cosier relationship between the bus companies and you know, and local councils and whatever, or politicians in Scotland. I'm just wondering whether the fact that well, I don't know if he still is, but one of the major donors to the SNP was the CEO of Stagecoach, might have had something to do with that. That lovely progressive Mr. Souter. The other thing, though, a question that I mean, and I'm asking this as a question. I mean, people who know my politics will know where I'm coming from here. This issue to do with what the legislation allows and doesn't allow in terms of public ownership of public transport or anything else for that matter. I'm just wondering, and I'd like both of you to comment if you feel able to, whether that is likely or could potentially improve now that Britain is no longer subject to some of the strict rules that were imposed in terms of public ownership by the European Union. We're no longer subject to a lot of that now. So I'm just wondering what you feel about
that. Do you want me to go first on that? You make a very valid point. You make a very valid point in terms of the European Union, the fourth rail package. They're preparing across. I mean, my comrades that I speak to in France and Italy and Germany, they're preparing for privatization of their railways along similar lines to us. And I think, you know, for some of us who voted leave to get rid of neoliberal diktats from Brussels, that was one thing. But whilst we got rid of that, we also got the Tories with a majority of 80. So whilst we're less hamstrung from Brussels, we've got these, you know, the national bloody capitalists over here who are quite happy to plug their neoliberal agenda. And you know, in Scotland, you make a valid point as well, because the SNP, it is not by any stretch of the imagination. If you talk to people in the Central Belt SNP, they're fairly left-wing and they're socialists. But you go up to Royal D-side, they're not anything like that. The only thing that unites them is a desire for independence. And that's probably why the neoliberal attitude on the buses in Glasgow and across Scotland is continuing. But the problem you have with we've got rid of the directives from Brussels that insisted on privatisation of public services. But we've got a Tory government in Westminster that's probably going to be more right-wing than anything we've ever seen when they get out this COVID pandemic. So the answer to the question is yes, but probably no, because of the shower that we've got in Westminster.
I think my take on it was, because I've only recently found out a little bit about what bus services are run like in other parts of in other parts of Europe and in other parts of the world. And I kind of feel like we did it to ourselves. I don't feel as though European legislation had much bearing on it. I think the decision to deregulate in the first place was less to do with European legislation and more to do with the Conservative government of 1985 at the time. Because I've been looking at this recently. You can still find, if you look, sort of, you know, the record of parliamentary discussions around the time just as it was being brought in. And the argument they were making for doing it then was not that they had to do it, but because they felt there'd been a decline in buses over the previous 20 years. And they felt that opening it up to competition from the private sector would make things better, essentially. They thought that fares would be cheaper, there would be more choice for people, and they were wrong, essentially. They got it completely wrong, but that was their argument for doing it, and that seemed a peculiarly British Tory reason for doing it, as far as I could make out. I'm not aware that there was any kind of European angle on it. I mean, I may be missing something there, because I would have only been 7 in 1986, so there's things that I would have missed. I mean, I do remember how insane the early years of deregulation were, because I was getting buses in the, you know, sort of early to mid 90s when it was absolutely insane, and there were, you know, the bus wars were on and things like that. But in terms of what I've been able to find out about the background for the actual decision in 1986, no, I don't think European legislation had any impact on it, and I don't really think, because obviously Brexit was ongoing while we were campaigning, and I think if anything we just saw the whole Brexit thing as a nuisance, because it made it harder for us to get media coverage if snap elections were being called and things like that. So I don't think it's, as far as I could tell at the time, I don't think it made much difference, and I don't think it would make much difference now really either.
I'd like to thank both our speakers. You've both been great speakers and also really helpful in getting the conversation and the debate going. So we'd love to hear back from you about these issues. So hopefully we can keep in touch and get some news in future.
Yeah.
But with that, I'll go to close the meeting. Just like to let everybody know, our next meeting is on Wednesday, the 21st of July. We will be looking at the police and crime bill and the Kill the Bill movement. We think it's going to be really essential that trade unions take a lead on this over the next several months. So we are actively at the moment engaging speakers, and we'll be publicising that shortly. So look out for the Facebook adverts, and we will be seeing you in roughly 4 weeks' time. Thank you very much, everyone.